that. I am Kate Schroeder, President and CEO at Interact for Health, and we are so excited and grateful to have this webinar with all of you today. And I especially recognize that this is a busy day, being Halloween and the morning of Halloween. So for those of you who have kiddos and are parents, thank you especially for making time to prioritize this today. Our topic is on toxic polarization, and the purpose that we are coming together here today is to increase our understanding, our awareness of what toxic polarization is and how it is impacting our community in the greater Cincinnati area. And most important of all, what we as individuals and as organizations can do to respond and help to address toxic polarization. And I am incredibly excited. We have a keynote speaker with Eric K. Ward with Race Forward, and also two panelists with Kate Hanissian and Robin Brands joining us today. So incredibly grateful to all of you for being part of this conversation. And I just want to start by saying, acknowledging that this is really timely for all of us right now. We are 5 days before a really, really important election that is increasing, I think, a lot of the polarization and the division and hateful language that is impacting all of us, our organizations, and our work. And one of the reflections I actually had is that for those who have lived in the Ohio area for probably at least 5-10 years now, you'll remember there was a time when Ohio was referred to as a purple state. And when we talked about Ohio as a purple state, it meant not just that we had relatively equal numbers of red and blue, but it implied the mixing, right? That we were mixing and together we were purple as a community and as a state. And it strikes me that that is not the perception of who we are now. In many ways, we are seen in Ohio and often described as these blue dots of cities surrounded by a sea of red. And I think that is that narrative impacts all of us because it actually impacts how open we are to each other and seeing our common values and our common humanity and how we then go about solving our community challenges together. So that is the purpose of today, is to just acknowledge that soup, that environment that we are all living in and how it impacts us. And I want to start by just introducing our incredible keynote speakers. So Eric K. Ward, he's an executive vice president with Race Forward. He brings over 3 decades of experience in leadership and community organizing, philanthropy. He's worked with leaders in government, in law enforcement, in business and civil rights organizations to advance civil rights work. And he is a nationally recognized author, speaker, and expert on the relationship between authoritarian movements, hate violence, and preserving inclusive democracy. And in 2021, he became the first American recipient of the Civil Courage Prize. So very excited to have Eric with us today. The way this is going to work, Eric is going to give a keynote for about 30 minutes, and then we're going to have a panel discussion with Kate Hanissian, who is the Chief Learning Officer at the YMCA of Greater Cincinnati, and also Robin Brands, who is a co-founder of Braver Angels in Greater Cincinnati. And so it will be the keynote followed by a panel discussion. If anyone on the call has questions that come up as we are going through these discussions, please put them in the Q&A chat, and we will try to incorporate those. I'm going to kick off the panel discussion with some initial questions, but would love to include any ones that come up from audience members as well. So please feel free to put those in throughout the session. And with that, I will hand it over to Eric. Thank you.
Thank you so much, my friend. It is wonderful to be with everyone today. Again, my name is Eric Ward, Executive Vice President at Race Forward. Race Forward is an organization dedicated to advancing racial equity and combating systemic injustice. At Race Forward, we support multiracial movements for racial justice by building relationships, advancing policy initiatives, and fostering resilience within communities. We believe that race equity is essential to building a just and inclusive society. And our work involves bridging divides, particularly in times of rising tension and polarization. I'm honored to be speaking with you both today and to be joined by the panel later um, to explore this challenge that is so crucial to our mission: how to address toxic polarization without sacrificing our values to racial equity. We are living in a time where racial polarization isn't just about disagreements. It's a force being used to deepen divisions, especially around race and identity. Our focus will be on actionable steps to counter this while holding firmly to the principles of justice and inclusion. Before I set the stage with a brief look at toxic polarization, I want to acknowledge the moment that we find ourselves in. All of us on this call today find ourselves under incredible stress, challenges to our leadership, challenges to our world, to our organizations, our communities, and our families and friends. Not one of us are immune to those stresses. It is important because in moments of stress, we often block stress out through denial, resistance, before moving to exploration and commitment. So I want to talk about this moment of denial, not for us to feel guilty, but to anchor ourselves and acknowledge the stress that we find ourselves under. The first is this: we are still in the midst of a global pandemic called COVID. Millions of people have been killed from COVID around the globe. This period of the pandemic was completely horrifying and remains so. It impacted all of our communities here in the United States, but also globally. I believe as society and as individuals, we have yet to come to terms with the deep loss and terror that the pandemic placed on our lives. If we were just talking about the pandemic, I could understand how it might be easy to evolve and move through this moment. But it wasn't just a pandemic. Joined by the pandemic has been a huge acceleration of climate disasters, hurricanes, floodings, droughts that have displaced millions around the globe and have displaced people within our own communities. We find ourselves at a time where government finds itself stretched to come to the aid of ordinary Americans because of the high level of climate disaster and stress occurring. To add to that stress, we are in a moment of political instability where many in our country question the values and the value of institutions and deep seated beliefs and ideas such as democracy. We watched that play out on January 6th in the nation's capital, as hundreds stormed our nation's capital seeking to disrupt the power of the vote in this country. Many were injured, some were killed. We also know that political violence and polarization did not just end on January 6th, but takes place each and every day in our communities. We see it through the rise of hate crimes and political violence each and every day. These stressors have real impact on our lives. And without acknowledging the stress that we are under, we often, sometimes unconsciously, take that stress and to try to find specific things to express our emotions. We see it in our own individual lives. Now, this is not a counseling session, but I think it's important as leaders for us to acknowledge this. When we feel powerlessness, we look for those things upon which we feel we have some power over. If you are in a relationship or you are in a family, what you know from direct experience is that most arguments and disagreements that become substantial arguments and disagreements often occur under stress, not when people are feeling relaxed. Now, take a look at our organizations and institutions that we reside in, the communities that we serve, communities that are often already under stress and marginalized. Look at the recent behavior of our own selves and the other leaders around us. And we first have to acknowledge the level of stress. It is in that stress that we find ourselves being taken advantage of. I grew up in Southern California at the time of desegregation. I often like to remind people that I was born in a country that did not consider Black people to be fully fledged human beings by the rule of law. It wasn't a hotly debated topic except by some within the civil rights movement. I was born in a society where Black people were not considered to be full fledged human beings. A great change came about, something we often refer to as the civil rights movement. Now, we often tell the story of Rosa Parks, and we say one day there was this Black woman in America, and one day she happened to be tired. And on that one day that this Black woman happened to be tired in America, she refused to give up her seat. She was arrested. Lo and behold, the greatest miracle happened like manna falling from heaven. All of a sudden, the entire Black community of Montgomery, Alabama, suddenly knew that it should just stay off the buses for an entire year. And people automatically started giving people rides. And they were so successful that after a year, the Montgomery Bus Association just decided out of the good of its heart that racial segregation was wrong and ended racial segregation. Everyone lived happily ever. That may be the myth that we're told in school, but the story is actually much more powerful and instructive. Segregation had existed for a long time. Segregation, or Jim Crow in the South, was the reaction, right? The negative backlash to the ending of slavery, chattel slavery in the South, a system that was created to exploit Black labor. It was that exploited labor that now makes us one of the strongest economic powers in this country. After the end of slavery, those who could not manage the change into a new society instituted a backlash, and that backlash became known as Jim Crow. Folks like Rosa Parks, Black women aren't just tired of one day in America, likely every day in America, was a long respected leader in her community. She and others wanted to challenge the morality of racial segregation in America. They set about organizing a plan, talking to individuals in their community, building network. They challenged Jim Crow effectively by planning and managing through the moment. It helped galvanize and inspire a nationwide civil rights movement that ultimately ended white supremacy as the rule of law. Now, I want to stop for a second. I'm not saying that white supremacy, a system of inequities that exist in institutions and practices and behaviors, no longer exist. What I'm simply acknowledging is that white supremacy was the legal rule of law. It was the singular frame upon which we understood one another across lines of race, how we understood economy, culture, and politics. Now imagine it was reinforced by an idea called white superiority, the belief that white people were inherently superior on one end and that Black people were inferior on the other end of that binary. How do you come to this moment where you suddenly, if you believe in segregation, you believe Black people are inferior, you have been socialized to believe that, how do you come to understand the loss of Jim Crow? How did people who you see as inferior in every way orchestrate the end of white supremacy, bringing forth a competing narrative, one called multiracial democracy or an inclusive society? In short, the idea that anyone and everyone in our society, regardless of whether you are a 68-year-old white male veteran living in rural Ohio or a 16-year-old trans Latina living in the heart of Cincinnati, that both of them and everyone in between has the right to live, love, worship, and work free from fear and bigotry. It was this emergence of a competing narrative that was established by the civil rights movement. Now, if you believe Black people are inferior, you're never going to believe that they could have done this on its own. And into that space comes the organizing vehicle that is taking advantage of our stress today. And it emerges as something called white nationalism. White nationalism was a belief that Black people didn't orchestrate the end of Jim Crow, that they were assisted by a global Jewish conspiracy. Today, that conspiracy is known as the Great Replacement Theory, the idea that there is a secret conspiracy of Jews who have taken control of the economy, of politics, who are bringing in immigrants and refugees in our country, shoring up feminists and African Americans and Latinos in order to orchestrate the taking over of the United States of America. I grew up at a time where I watched the rise of this white nationalist movement in the Pacific Northwest. I moved from Southern California to Oregon in 1986. We watched the political violence and the attempts by these organizations to take advantage of our stresses, demographic anxiety being one of those stresses. As the country changes, we can look at it as either a threat or opportunity. I often remind folks that our bodies can't often tell the difference between excitement and anxiety. Our bodies actually respond in the same exact way. Whether you're feeling anxiety as a performer on stage or excitement to be on that stage, your body again reacts in the same way. The only way it knows the difference between excitement and anxiety is by what the brain tells it that it's experiencing. Since the victories of the civil rights movement, another social movement not grounded in inclusion but exclusion has been hard at work telling us that the things we feel around demographic changes, shifts in economy, and inclusion aren't excitement about the possibilities of what it might mean to be a society moving forward together, but rather a danger, something that we must protect ourselves from, a conspiracy calling on us to use violence and to build silos rather than bridges. This is the moment we find ourselves in the United States of America. But I want to be clear about something. When we're talking about toxic polarization, this white nationalist social movement understands a few things. The first thing that it understands is that it doesn't bring the biases of homophobia or anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, sexism, xenophobia to our communities, that it simply organizes the bigotry that already exists. Two, most of us don't spend our days trying to understand social movements. And because we don't understand social movement dynamics, we're not often aware when our stresses and anxieties are being taken advantage of, given political organization. In short, all of us have biases that we carry around, both conscious and unconscious biases. What's different about this moment is that those conscious and unconscious biases are being organized into political formations that gain their power through othering, not solving the problems that most of us face in a society: housing, transportation, education, health. What do we want for our children? Instead, our unconscious biases are used to divide and drive division. I want to now move with this understanding to the question of toxic polarization. Toxic polarization goes beyond ordinary disagreement. It fosters distrust, resentment, and often outright hostility. This isn't just dividing us, it is actively being used to halt progress in our communities, regardless of whether you are white, Black, Hispanic, Native American, Asian Pacific Islander, male, female, rich or poor. We see polarization exploited on social media, in community conflicts, and in legislative spaces where compromises become impossible. This weaponization of divisions, particularly racial ones, challenges the work we do each and every day. Toxic polarization also undermines the work of racial equity by distracting from core justice issues. It pushes communities to see equity as a threat rather than a benefit and distorts the dialogues needed for collective progress. Now, there's a temptation in these moments to dilute race equity principles in the pursuit of easing polarization. But I'm here to tell you from experience that that only deepens divides. At Race Forward, we've seen how essential it is to maintain a clear and consistent commitment to justice for marginalized communities. In short, one of the ways that we can immediately respond to toxic polarization is to focus on our values rather than political position. It doesn't matter whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. It does not matter whether you can see yourself as conservative or liberal or left or right. Those are political positions that have been polarized. What's important is, do you believe in opportunity for all? Do you believe that everyone should have a fair chance? Do you believe that corruption in government and institutions undermines our abilities to move forward with equity? Those are values, and we don't need political positions to tell us what our values are in a society. At Race Forward, as I've said, we see how essential it is to lift up values over political position. I want to talk a little bit about strategies to address polarization without compromising equity. Stay rooted in your values, as I've said, even while building bridges, keeps us grounded in our mission. Commit to transparency and dialogue. We can create conversations where everyone feels heard, but we must be clear that equity principles are non negotiable. If we are seeking to build a alternative to polarization, it has to be grounded in inclusion. The idea that everyone has the right to feel heard and belonging. That must be a non-negotiable value, especially when some viewpoints deny or minimize harm. Foster honest conversation and bridge building. Storytelling has been at the heart of my work, connecting communities and fostering understandings. It's one of the most powerful ways to bridge divides without sacrificing the truth. It is why arts and culture and storytelling are so important in polarized moments. It reminds us of the connections we have to one another across lines of race, religion, gender, and sexual orientation. As I said, I grew up in a segregated society. When I went to a desegregated school in the late 1970s, it wasn't going to be race. That was the bridge that was going to bring us together as Black, Latino, and white students. What became the bridge was the rise of punk, the rise of hip hop. It gave us a space where the identities that separated us weren't the predominant, always the dominant identities in the room. We created and cultivated a competing identity. Now, that didn't mean racism went away. It didn't mean racial segregation or the opposition to racial segregation went away. It didn't mean that our unconscious biases suddenly flew out the window or the inequitable policies and practices. What it meant, though, was that we had another space to imagine what we might be in society and how we might get there. What bands we listened to, what bands we sang in or played in became more important than our differences. It is one of the most powerful ways to bridge divides without sacrificing the truths. Arts, culture, and narrative forces us to focus on values over political position. We have to create platforms for cross community conversations. And we found that dialogues across these lines of differences, right, rooted in culture and in the arts, can help bridge divides without diminishing the focus on marginalized voices. Strengthening community resilience and multiracial solidarity. Our work at Race Forward underscores the importance of solidarity, especially across lines of race, class, and identity. When communities see their struggles as interconnected, they stand stronger together. Build coalitions across issue areas. Partner with economic and social justice organizations by modeling how solidarity can help address both racial inequities and shared economic challenges. Do it across lines of politics grounded in unified values. We have to model what the opposite of polarization looks like. Use strategic communication tactics. We must counter misinformation and disinformation that runs rampant on social medias, sometimes originating here in the United States, sometimes originating outside the United States in order to take advantage of anxiety. When we counter misinformation and disinformation, even ahead of time, we help communities inoculate themselves. It's about telling compelling and accurate stories that resonate beyond divisive narratives. Leverage your storytelling and data. Use relatable stories backed up by clear data to help bridge divides. Just a few more things here, and then we'll turn to the panel. Here are some potential pitfalls to avoid in this moment. Again, diluting equity for harmony, compromising racial equity or other forms of equity for the sake of reducing tension is a pitfall we cannot afford. It will make things harder in the long term. We must remain vigilant to stay true to our mission. A warning against both siderism. Equating all perspectives equally is not ensuring that all perspectives are heard. Those are two different things. Beware of equating all perspectives equally, especially those that deny the values that you care about. It creates a harmful false balance. Last, set boundaries for equity centered conversations. At Race Forward, we ensure that every step towards the common ground and the common good holds equity at its center. Philanthropic and cultural institutions, if you represent them, you play a vital role. You cannot ask organizations, your grantees and partners to take on this work without doing the investments in your own institutions and leadership as well. You are often better placed and better anchored in this moment, right, of turbulence to ride out the tension and to model how we move through these moments. Your long term investments are needed both internally and externally to strengthen resilience and provide the tools of counterpolarization in this moment. Again, support the arts and narrative building, champion the arts and culture in this moment. Knowing the stories we tell and the narratives we build on are critical in fostering solidarity. Continue to invest in narrative and culture projects in this moment, even if they are not the specific position you hold. What you're looking for in this moment is a broad, diverse array of stories. Not again, painting them all as equal, but so they are heard and debated and embraced so that we can find the way forward together. I want to thank you all for listening to me over this last period. I look forward to hearing your thoughts and, of course, the thoughts of the panel about how we can take these principles further. I invite questions and encourage collaboration and exploration of actionable steps for bridging the divide. This approach, I believe, balances strategic insight and real world experience. We are in a moment of great change. We have to acknowledge this change is happening. It's not about preventing it, it is about, in some ways, limiting the damage and the harm of relationships that will be needed on the other side of this change to move us all forward together. It is about getting our organizations and ourselves out of resistance, resisting what is needed to be done to hold these important relationships together. It is about exploring new practices and tools, both internally and externally. And it is a commitment to one another. It is the idea that this is our moment in history. I often think of a game I used to play when I was a kid. We grew up very poor. And by the end of summer, we had run out of all resources. And we're just simply waiting for school to start again. You would often find us sitting in our apartment, out in front of our apartment building as kids on the sidewalk, playing a game called If I Were. If I Were was simply like this. If I were driving down the freeway and the brakes went out, here's what I would do. And then we'd argue as kids about how we would or wouldn't get out of that situation, what was realistic, what wasn't. Or if I were in the zoo and all of a sudden the lion got out of the cage, here's what I would do. The question that would come up each and every summer was, if I were in the midst of the 1960 civil rights movement, here is what I would do. And boy, would we argue about what we would or wouldn't do. We didn't understand the choiceless choices of our parents and grandparents. We were full of bravado about what we would put up with and what we wouldn't. That game, and particularly that question, has always haunted me. How would I have shown up in the midst of the 1960 civil rights movement? What would I have done? What would have been my values? What would my grandchildren say about me from that moment in my life? I've pondered it. Many of you on this call may have your own moments in history where you wonder, how might you have shown up? What would you have done? Would you have frozen? Would you have been a hero? Would you have been a bystander? Would you have been a perpetrator? Well, I figured out about 10 years ago, I no longer had to ponder that question. And I'm here to tell each of you today, none of you have to ponder that question as well. And the truth is however you would have shown up in the midst of the 1960 civil rights movement or any other historical moment is exactly how you will show up when you leave the seminar today. Make it count. We have a choice point as leaders in front of us. We can choose to pander to the stresses of our community, or we can choose to be leaders, understanding that our communities are under stress, but it is our job not to pander to the emotive moment, but to provide real solutions. It is our choice point to understand we cannot do that unless we are in dialogue, which means staying in the room. And staying in the room is easy when everything is going well. It takes real courage to stay in a room when things are difficult. Make it count. Look at your values, hold them close, allow them to be the anchor in this moment. Understand that toxic polarization has to be organized. But if it's organized, it can be unorganized. An alternative can be put forth, but it won't be in silence. We have to make a commitment to stay in that room together. That's how those folks showed up in the 1960s. They stayed in the room together. Those who resisted the rise of Nazi Germany stayed in the room together. Stay in the room. It is the best inoculation that I know to toxic polarization. Thank you, and I'll turn it back.
Eric, thank you so much. I feel like we've been to a university seminar and to church all in the last 35 minutes here, and appreciate you waking us up on this morning with a history lesson and a call to awareness on where we are in this moment in history with the social change and social movements going on, and calling on us to question how we show up in that moment, and giving us some of the tools and practical solutions in that. So thank you, thank you. I would like to invite Robin and Kate into the conversation as well, because Robin and Kate are two of our local leaders who spend the most time thinking about and working on bringing more people into the room and showing up in this moment in history. So Robin, maybe we could start with you if you want to begin by introducing yourself and talk about the work that you are doing and any reflections you have on some of the insights and observations that Eric shared.
Absolutely. First, thank you so much for having me. I'm honored, and I'll get to it. But Eric, that was incredible and just so much resonated with me. My name's Robin Brands. I'm a retired GE Aviation business manager and engineer. And when I retired, one of the things, I had a list of 4 things that I really wanted to do. And one of them was around social justice. And I really reached out a lot trying to figure out how I thought I could make a difference. And I came to the conclusion that the best thing I could do was find ways to help people bridge divides and have difficult conversations, because I don't see how we solve a lot of these issues in our silos. So one of the things, Eric, I'm sorry, that's my cat, and he's really loud. He's 19 and he's deaf and he screams. So, our society is so silo driven, and the pandemic just made it so much more. And that really resonated with me when you said that, Eric. I mean, people, tend to live in, if not segregated communities where the people have a lot of similarities, more similarities than differences. Social media, people drive, all that drives people to hear their values reflected all the time at them, and their beliefs, even if they just don't get the other side. So I think getting out of your silos is very important. So when I got into Braver Angels, which is Braver Angels, I'm a co-chair for Greater Cincinnati. It is an organization that's working to depolarize the country. And we're doing a lot of the things Eric said. We bring people together. Now, to be fair, the people that come, the people that engage with us are the middle. But guess what? The middle's really big. Those ends that you hear all the time that sound like they're the majority, they're the minority. And so it gives me hope when I see all of these people in the middle who recognize a problem, and we engage, and we teach skills on having these conversations, and we practice having these conversations on topics from reproductive rights to immigration, to climate change, to who would be worse for our country. At the time, it was Biden or Trump. Now it's, you know, Kamala. So it's a great organization. We'll talk a little bit more about it. The other thing that resonated with me from Eric's story is storytelling. That's one of the things, it's much more disarming than coming back at somebody with facts. You might want to get the facts in there at some point, but when you're just talking about my perspective and my story, people, they really can't argue with your story. It's your story. So one story I have is I grew up early part of my life in a very racially diverse community, and a lot of my friends were Black. We had an issue walking home from middle school, or actually it was elementary school. I had somebody pull a knife on me. My mom was like, we got to get out. And we moved to an all-white neighborhood. There was one Black family in the neighborhood. And I had a very hard time adjusting. It sounds odd. I'm very fair-skinned. I'm clearly white. But I had all these mannerisms, all this language, all this culture and music and everything from the Black community. And I was different. So I felt like, well, I don't understand by far the Black experience. I have a little taste of that I can bring to a conversation with white people with some authenticity. And so I feel that's a way I can tell a story. That's an example of a way I can tell a story. And then the other thing that really resonated with arts and culture. So I was at an Arts Wave event last night, and the lady that is driving, that's leading the Children's Theater, won a very prestigious award. And you know what, it's fantastic what she's doing, but the story that resonated with me is she showed, and they do a lot to bring kids who would never get to be in or get to see theater to the Children's Theater. And she talked about a story where the princess was a good princess, and it was a twist on a story where the princess isn't so good. And afterwards, she showed a very young African-American girl from a very poor background say, when I grow up, I want to be a good princess. And she's like, two things. She wanted to be good, and she saw the possibility of being a princess. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kate.
Oh, thank you, Robin, for that reflection. Thank you, Kate, for this opportunity. And most importantly, Eric, thank you so much for grounding us and me this morning in your deep experience and your wisdom and your knowledge. I personally needed it, and it has helped me to continue to even have this conversation in the midst of where we are as a country right now, where we are as a community right now. So much of what you said just echoed and strengthened things that I know to be true. I currently serve as the Chief Strategy and Innovation Officer at the YMCA, and I also work for the International YMCA, which allows me to work with populations across different race, economic class, age, political values. For the last 25 years, I've been working to try and understand and get curious about systems and outcomes and things that I saw in society that I just didn't understand. How did it get that way? How does it get this way? And I've done that as an educator in communities that have been greatly affected by poverty. I did that through criminal justice reform work. I've done that through the founding of an organization called Design Impact that works at the intersection of racial equity principles, creativity, and leadership. And I've done that here at the YMCA. And as I continue to do that work, I continue to strengthen what it means to be open-hearted and to stay curious in the face of such despair. And it is difficult. And especially as things over the last, well, it's, you know, things have been increasingly polarized. That muscle that I've had to tap into is getting weary, and conversations like this help strengthen it. So again, thank you. I think so many of the things you said resonated with me, but the one I really wanted to pull out that you mentioned was the comments you made. A lot of them were really around this need for self-work. You talked about the amygdala response, essentially, that our brain has, that our bodies can't tell the difference between excitement and anxiety, that we're often not aware when our stressors and anxieties are being taken advantage of. And so I think our work as folks that are interested in bridging the divide in moments of toxic polarization have to start with that self-work, both in the long term and in the short term, to check in multiple times with our bodies to say, how am I showing up in this moment? A great mentor of mine, actually have this quote on my computer, so hopefully you'll bear with me, but it says, presence is the vehicle by which you trigger other people's potential. So what is the presence you need to have to be most effective and present in the moment that you're in? And the only way to be aware of that presence is through quite a bit of self-work. And I fail at that often. I like to think I'm getting better. But I appreciate, Eric, your call to that thing happening inside of us, particularly as the rhetoric grows. And how are we able to stay open-hearted and stay curious in these rooms? And Robin, I agree with you. When I am in the room is when I build hope. When I'm alone in my home reading the headlines is when I fear the most and find myself tied up in narratives of othering. So I'll stop there, but I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you both. And I do want to remind folks, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. And also, there will be a short evaluation form shared towards the end in the chat. So please, just heads up, we welcome feedback on that as well. Eric, I want to start with a question to you. I know some will say it's easier to promote the concepts that you're talking about around bridging and social cohesion if you're not a member of a population which is often marginalized or oppressed. And so I'm curious, what discussions can we have with those who feel like these practices can undermine the racial equity work in which we've been really heavily invested?
It's a good question, and it's fair. We have to understand that one of the challenges around holding the need to counter toxic polarization is polarization has often been used by some, not all, right, to try to pause uncomfortable conversations around inequity. Um, uh, um, Often focusing on how things are said rather than what is being said. And many leaders marginalized leaders have taken that, and sadly, as a result, use that as a umbrella definition of what countering polarization work is, and it has harmed our work. I say, as a person who, look, I am a kid who grew up in a one-room motel from seventh grade through my senior year that my mom paid for by the week. Um, I understand both the frustration that comes from resistance to understanding inequity and the stresses that come with it. But we also, as leaders, cannot sit in our emotive moments as well, right? Our frustration is not an organizing tactic or strategy. And our communities need us to not only be oppositional mobilizers, but also to model what governance of a multiracial society may look like. And a governance of a multiracial society means that we will continue to deal with opposition, conscious opposition, unconscious anxiety for generations to come. And we have to learn how to manage that work. I'm not putting the blame, I'm not blaming the victims here. What I'm saying is, even those of us who are leaders from marginalized communities have our own choice point to make. And that choice point, I hope, is about delivering what is best for our communities. It's not fair, right? I'm not here to say that that's a fair thing. It's absolutely unfair that we can't sit in the emotions of the harms and the vulnerabilities that we face each and every day. But it's not about fairness for us. It's about fairness for our communities and the generations of our communities to come. So one thing I might suggest tangibly that could help those marginalized leaders get there, right? Again, I don't want folks going here saying, Eric said it's all on our backs again. Look, we are resilient leaders and we can do a lot. But sadly, I'm going to put on my philanthropy hat for a second. Former program officer from the Ford Foundation and Atlantic Philanthropies, former chair and current board member of the Proteus Fund. I have been in philanthropy for many years. And I'm going to say, in this moment where the conversation around polarization is so vital, many of us as funders are doing something very irresponsible. We are asking marginalized communities to choose, right, in terms of the resources and time we give them to either answer the real needs of their communities or address toxic polarization, right? And and that's unfair, right? In truth, we have to create funds that allow these marginalized leaders to do both, not put them in a scarcity model. And so I think one of the things we can do in philanthropy right now, right, or do things like establish dedicated leadership development funds at the regional level, right, aimed at training marginalized community leaders. I'm going to say across Cincinnati and rural counties. I know you also cross state lines there, many of philanthropic institutions there, um, to address polarization and advance race equity, right, in parallel, in tandem to one another. And that fund could provide scholarships, stipends, resources for leaders from Black, Latino, immigrant, LGBTQ plus, low income backgrounds to access specialized training and mentorship. I can't imagine how phenomenal I might be if I had gotten counseling or coaching from someone like Robin or Kate, right? And that didn't have to just simply stumble across this on my own. Navigating polarization and ensuring community engagement is a practice that comes with experience. I could see training in conflict resolution and mediation, support for public communications and media skills, right? Again, access to mentorship and peer networks, resource toolkits, all of those things, small grants for pilot projects. This was a long answer. Um, but the truth is there's much that can really be done around this work right now that is so exciting. You know, I have to remind people often there is no rule book or playbook around how to manage a healthy, multiracial, and vibrant multiracial society. It's never been done before. And so the tools that need to be created are critically important. But what we can do is incentivize, right, that tool building by creating small grants for pilot projects, right, that bring together, right, a unique setting of communities and their leaders to initiate or scale community projects that address polarization, right, and still advance the dialogue and the work around race equity or other issues of equity. Okay, that was a long answer. I've been waiting for like a decade for someone to ask me that question.
No, thank you, Eric. That is great. And I realize as we're going deep on this, could you just touch a bit on like what is the difference between toxic polarization and just differences in general? Like when does it become toxic?
Yeah. So let me get here's a good example. Um uh so polarization itself could be look, uh I don't like ooh, this is touchy right now, but I'm gonna go there. Here's a polarized piece. I don't like the Yankees, right? And so when I go to the baseball game, I'm gonna sit on the Mets side. Notice I didn't say the Dodgers there, right? Uh, um, I'm gonna sit on the side of the Mets, right? That is a polarized fan base, right? Toxic polarization, right? means it's just not that I have a difference of opinion around what I support. I'm going to bring actionable steps that create harm for those who hold another opinion. Or I'm not going to allow the opposing supporters into the stadium or on the streets or on the buses. Toxic polarization is the fact that when there is a White Sox Cubs cross L series, right, that you have to bring in a significant larger police force to stop the physical violence between supporters, right? It's when polarization is, the best way to think about it is polarization is given organization. And when its polarization is given organization, it often expresses itself in toxic ways, violence, punitive, shunning, right? There's I think of the events around Palestine and Israel. That's not the conversation today, right? A very polarized a moment that has become toxic, right? In its polarizations, in its expressions. People have been shot, beaten, have lost their jobs, are shunning one another. It's moved beyond a difference of opinion and trying to find a way forward to trying to remove one side from the equation.
Thank you. That is very helpful. Robin, I want to go to you as someone who's been through Braver Angels. And it might be helpful to just share a bit more about what Braver Angels is and how it works in our community. But if you could explain that and then also touch a bit on anything you see normal, well-meaning folks doing regularly that can help to perpetuate often unintentionally toxic polarization.
Absolutely. Yeah. Braver Angel. So like I said, our mission is to depolarize the country. It's focused politically, but we're polarized in a lot of ways. Everything's become political almost. And to do that, we have so we have a local alliance. We have several actually, but Greater Cincinnati Alliance, and we hold monthly meetings where sometimes we bring in a speaker. Sometimes we do a little skill building. Often we do a little skill building and practice difficult conversations in a very amounts of forms. But we also have online training at the national level, online debates, and we do workshops. Like we have a red-blue workshop that is one of our signature workshops where you bring an equal number of conservative-leaning and liberal-leaning people. And our co-founders, by the way, I'm a co-chair, not a co-founder. I wish I was a co-founder. Our co-founders from Lebanon, Ohio, one of them is from Lebanon, Ohio, started with this red-blue workshop. The very first thing they did after the 2016 election was say, we got to do something. Let's see if this works. One of the co-founders has a background in marriage counseling. He brought half conservatives, half liberals into a workshop. We had a structured program. And you can go see the video online if you just YouTube Braver Angels, Red Blue, Uniting America, Reuniting America, Red Blue. And it's striking to see when we talked about getting out of your silos and having conversations, and he structured the conversations so that he facilitated them, and we do some of that. But it still stands out in my mind when you watch this video that one of the liberals was he's a person of color. I think he is Latino, I believe, but I could be wrong. Gay man. And there was a white, older evangelical Christian man, and they happened to be sitting next to each other at the beginning. And you can see by the body language and everything else that there is a lot of mistrust, very uncomfortable. But by the end of this, and at the time, the seminar was 2 days. It's like 4 hours now. But by the end of this, they became friends. They're friends to this day. I've met them together at the convention, and they talk about their things they disagree on, and it's fabulous. So it just goes to show part of this is getting out of your silos and really listening. So the media would have you believe that you know what the other side thinks. And that, just think about it. If you're Black, if you're poor, if you're rural, if you're urban, do you think you believe, like everybody else in that group, everything the same? And the answer is no. And if you start talking to people, our goal is not to change anybody's mind. It's to respect the other side and understand the other side. But what you find in doing that is we often find we agree on more than we disagree on if we can just have the conversation. So that's what Braver Angels is. And you can go to braverangels.org. We have tons of resources online, in person. But back to what are a couple of things people do, unintentionally maybe that drive this polarization. And one is so simple. When you're speaking to people who agree with you, how do you talk? What language do you use about the other side? And if you use insightful, hurtful, mean language, and you attribute all these negative things to them and that they're evil and they're out to hurt the country, you are fostering that polarization. Because if you can understand the other side a little bit, you don't have to agree with it. Just understand why someone might believe something different. And when it comes up with people who agree with you and you say, I do agree with you, but I was fascinated that I found out this. And I can understand why somebody might believe it, and that all of a sudden they start thinking, wow, that other side might not be quite as evil, right? So that's one thing. And then the other one I've talked about is getting out of your echo chambers, as much as you can. I've worked really hard at that. When I was an engineer, I got on, worked on different charity boards and got involved with a lot of groups downtown to get out of my engineering, science, suburban background. And then we moved downtown. And I can tell you, when we first moved downtown, I would walk around and when I would say hi to people, many of them African-American, many of them poor or poorer. And I live in a nicer part of town. I'm fortunate. And they would kind of look at me like, yeah, here today, gone tomorrow, whatever. But now we've been down here a couple of years, and every time, I try to say hi, and it's amazing. People, they say, hey, and oh, I like that outfit, and how you doing today? And because they know you now, right? And if you don't get out of your silos, you don't hear the other side, and you don't know these other people.
Thank you.
Kate, can I say something just to reinforce what Robin is saying? It is so important. I spent years amongst the militia movement that included white nationalists here in the Pacific Northwest in the mid 90s to the early 2000s. I can tell you that was not an adoption of each other's political platforms, right? But the humanization piece of this is so critically important, right? And it matters in so many ways. At the end of the day, right? I don't like to do sides, but if we're gonna be a side, our side cannot be committed to the destruction, right, or the removal of the other side. That's not the actual solution. That is partaking in a cycle of toxic polarization. And it's a hard thing to hold because there will be sides who will continue to try to make the binary us and them. And it really takes a practice. Other folks will say, well, that's easy. That sounds like the easy work. But I got to tell you, if we can't get those basic building blocks that Robin just laid out, right, how will we ever build the energy and momentum to tackle the real complex conversations that we have?
Thank you. And yes, I agree that, it's going to take, and I think that's a good observation about, we can't be committed to the destruction of the other side. And it does, for these challenges, whether it's climate change, whether it's improving the health in our community, improving education, it does take broad coalitions and working together across sectors. So Kate Hennessy, I'm curious to hear your reflections on this, just around the role of bridging and social cohesion in terms of improving the health of our community overall.
Yeah, oh my gosh, my brain is going a million miles. There's so many important things we're talking about here. Yeah, I mean, at the YMCA, we get the opportunity to think from a health perspective often. You know, we think about the opportunity that the YMCA gives for folks to have access to health and wellness. Part of that is being in proximity to one another, literal, just physical proximity. So I appreciate, Robin, the example you were giving. And part of what we try and do and think about is, what does it look like to take folks that are traditionally isolated from one another, have them in the same space together and experience joy. Eric, I loved the point you made about art, culture, and storytelling. I was thinking, for those of you from the Cincinnati community on the phone call, we recently had an incredible art installation called Blank in our community. And it's one of the, frankly, the best cultural experiences I've had in the world, let alone in Cincinnati. It was incredible. And one of the things I was remarking on is how many folks were out in the streets appreciating art, really, some of it very cutting edge art, folks old and young, and folks that may have appeared more, you know, conservative or MAGA hats versus, you know, like essentially all folks. And the joy, and I haven't felt that in our community in that way. And I think there's something about that when we go beyond the intellectual experience of this, and we start with the human connection, as you all have mentioned, we start with values, Eric, I really appreciated that call. And we start with shared experience. We start with joy. We start with delight, and art can bring us there. Culture can bring us there. There then, in our shared humanity, is the opportunity for growth, I think. And I don't think we often start there with this stuff. We start with our brains and our othering and our cerebral approaches. And so I am also, as we're talking about, there's urgent bridge building that's addressing very deep-seated conflict, like we were mentioning, Eric, the Israel-Palestine issue, but there's also the preventative work of how we structure our society to avoid this long-term problem in the future. Eric, I really appreciated how you defined toxic polarization in your Mets example. And sometimes I think that we think that of that as very acute, like the toxic polarization becomes as an acute violence, an acute situation. But as you mentioned, toxic polarization is given organization, and it requires organization. And I would argue that the long-term way we've structured our society, with increasing economic disparity between rich and poor, increasing geographic distance with the advent of cars, you know, the way that we've structured our society has created toxic polarization, and that in turn directly affects our health outcomes. So we know, for example, that when people have the opportunity to make friendship across class lines, they are more likely to get out of poverty. We know that. That is a fact. Dr. Raj Chetty's wonderful work out of Harvard shows us that through research. And yet we continue to live farther apart from one another by class. We continue to grow the economic divide between rich and poor. So when I think about increasing our health outcomes, we also know that when we are lonely and isolated from one another, we are more likely to suffer from heart disease. We are more likely for suicide. We are more likely for depression. So what does it look like to create moments that get us out of that othering by the structures in which we live and work and play? And that's the work we're trying to do at the YMCA. Some of that is through, we'd have the design of small groups where we're working to bring together the people that might share a value. Let's say they value knitting or cooking potatoes. It doesn't really matter, right? They're having a shared connection, and then through that process, being in proximity to one another across difference, and then saying, what does it look like to build together differently, even though we may have very different beliefs and opinions. So that's some of the work I think that we're doing to try and address community health through bridge building and belonging.
Thanks, Kate. That is really helpful. And I actually think a good segue, because we've talked a bit about what individuals can do. I also want to go to more the organization level and share a question. Thank you, Angela, for your question. Angela says, I would love to hear some perspectives on how institutions can recognize their blind spots and get better at bringing marginalized voices into the center of our conversations. And Eric, I don't know if you have thoughts on that, or Kate, anyone chime in.
I do have thoughts. You know, it's you know, the hard part is institutions are not made up of robots. They are made up of people, and we as people are we're just, you know, we're not perfect. That's just not who we are. Um, and so, you know, the first step is really just being honest. So it starts with leadership. The first is institutions creating and supporting space that allow individuals to understand what their conscious and unconscious biases are, right? Not in some kind of confessional way, right? But to recognize that we all have them, and if we have them, they will play a role, and that doesn't make us a bad person in the world, right? Lots of so I'll use an example. Lots of people have demographic anxiety, right? The changing of demographics creates anxiety. I can prove it. If you've ever walked into a big reception or meeting space where you didn't know anyone, right? That feeling you're feeling is called anxiety. It's rarely framed or feels like excitement, right? It feels like anxiety. And when we can acknowledge that it is us who is holding the anxiety, it allows us then to make a choice about how we will enter the space. If institutions start penalizing us for feeling that anxiety or making us feel bad, the choice will always be to feel guilty and to remove ourselves, right? Never to enter. Thus, we don't solve the problem, because how is demographic anxiety solved? It's solved in the same way that all forms of anxiety are solved. We'll use the fear of flying. I have friends who flying creates real anxiety for them. And I know some who have sought help. The answer they got from those flying coaches wasn't to stop flying, right? It was to fly more, actually, because the secret is we don't overcome our anxiety. What we learn is how to manage it, but to manage it calls for constant exposure. And so one of the things institutions can do is to really check their values, to make sure that they're creating space for leaders to acknowledge, right, their own biases, unconscious and conscious. Again, it doesn't need to be a public or institutional confession, self-reflection, and then to understand that an institution isn't going to throw them out the window the first time that that unconscious bias or bias comes into play, right? That there's a chance, an understanding that the institution is going to hold them and continue to ask us to land back on our value statements, on the mission statements of the institution. So that's one piece. The other, in terms of marginalized voices, is and again, I'm going to go back to philanthropy. I know it's not just philanthropy. The second is um, we have to stop demanding that our marginalized leaders only show up as the oppositional voices, and we have to prepare those voices for the role of governance. Right? Uh, Look, if I'm taking folks to task, it's not because I like performing around taking people to task. It's because I want to lead a healthy community that provides resources for all, not just my specific community, but understanding I'm part of a broader community. Learning how to govern, right? Serving on boards is a part of governance. Um, not just being on the program committee, but being on the finance committee or the HR committee are ways that as leaders, we also get to learn the other components of a functioning, healthy society. The third is this. Please, please, please. I'm going to just go back to Kate and Robin. They have both said it. I think I have said it. right? What institutions can do in this moment is to model not the conflict, but model what the solution might look like. And again, people are going to accuse you of moderation or centrism or I don't know liberalism or whatever the word is, because no one in points of hyperpolarization. I'm looking at Kate and Robin to confirm this, but I'm guessing no one in the point of hyperpolarization likes anything that doesn't appear to be binary, right? No one likes complexity in a moment of hyper polarization, but what institutions can do is to actually bring more complexity, right? We are in a moment right now around one issue where both sides, because it has become two sides, are spending most of their energy trying to get the other side to shut up, right? To be quiet. When in fact the answer is not less conversation or people saying less. We actually need people to say more, and we need to make complex the things that are being said because that's how we find the way forward. Okay, what does that all mean? At the end of the day, right? Institutions need to first revisit their value statements and to encourage leaders to reflect on their own values and unconscious bias. The second piece is we have to move beyond just mobilization and opposition to a conversation around governance. We have to provide an alternative to what the polarized voices are saying governance looks like in this moment, or that a multiracial society doesn't know how to govern. And every institution can open up space to build that governance experience. And then the third is our institutions have to stop becoming sectarians in this moment. That doesn't mean value free, by the way, Washington Post, if you're listening. It means, right, that our job is to practice complexity, right? To really kind of not be binary and to hold uncomfortability, because I can guarantee a healthy multiracial society will be both very exciting. It will be very exciting, but there will be moments of deep uncomfortability. And we're not trying to make that go away, right? We're not trying to make polarization go away, right? What we're trying to do is to build new tools that allow us to manage the uncomfortability so that it doesn't drain the excitement that we all feel.
Yeah, I would love to add on to that if that's okay, Kate. I just really appreciate what you said, Eric, particularly around institutions acknowledging their own biases. And I think, and as us as individuals as well, I think that can be really tough for institutions to do. So I just want to name a couple tools that I think are really helpful. One is the cultural intelligence assessment and or the IDI. These are very, very wonderful tools that take a cultural approach, which I sometimes think is actually a great gateway into this kind of conversation, is my ability to understand culture and different cultures. And what that helps me understand is that there is not one right way. There is a way that I see, that I've been learned, that I've trained, that I've understood, but there is not one right way. And so as an institution, we actually just as an organization, we all took the IDI and yesterday went through our results. And what's fascinating about these tests and these assessments is that consistently across the board, institutions and individuals, one thing is true: they rank their abilities higher than their actual abilities. So their perceived ability to handle complexity and cultural complexity is much higher than their actual ability. And this is true for individuals across the board. We tend to think we're better at it than we actually are. And so understanding that it's a very quick tool that can help organizations just inherently see that that difference between my perceived understanding and my actual, that's very helpful, I think, for institutions. And Eric, I just want to reiterate what you said about the simple binary versus the increased complexity and nuance in our society, where we're challenged for these soundbite marketing clips, and organizations are challenged in that. I think our responsibility is to take a step back from that and stay in that complexity and that uncomfortability and that resilience. That is what resilience is, right? It's not the avoidance of discomfort, is the ability to stay in discomfort. And the more that we build that muscle as institutions, as leaders, as individuals, the greater chance we have at holding this multiracial, beautiful, diverse society that we envision. So I just wanted to echo those things, and I appreciate it.
Yeah, but
Thank you.
I would
Go
just like
ahead.
to add a real quick thing. I agree with everything you said. And I have a little simpler thing is that there is some, whether you did it through Braver Angels or other places, there's some very basic skills training that's not rocket science, but reminding people and practicing it on, I mean, that's what our workshops do, practicing it on a very difficult topic. And having the leaders model that on down so that when conflict does come up, you're armed and can model how you should behave, because it's only going to get worse, unfortunately.
Yes, thank you. And I recognize we are pressing up on the time here. We have a couple more questions in the chat. I do want to ask this one from Brittany. She says, I'm curious what the panel's thoughts are on repair when harm is caused by personal actions around the toxic divide. Can you speak to your approach to harm and repair?
Yeah, I'm not going to go first this time. I'm going to let others talk. But yes, I think we can each answer some perspectives offer a perspective on that.
I think there's a lot. I know we're close on time, so I'll try and be succinct, Brittany. I know that there's a lot here. I think something that when we talk about complexity that we have to do is hold the complexity of two things needing to happen at the same time. I think that you're absolutely right about spaces to repair and heal and honor the harm that has happened and that it's consistently happening. The hard part about that is that it's consistently happening, and it's very difficult to heal a wound that's consistently being ripped open. So while we have to have spaces for those conversations, we have to have what I would call off-ramps within our processes, within our conversations, for those folks that are saying, this is getting to a place of me that I'm beyond discomfort. I'm in my panic zone. I'm in my space where I do not feel psychologically safe. We have to build moments in our conversations and our experiences that provide off ramps and resources for folks in those having those experiences, and design for that from the get-go. I think we have to design for that in our invitation at the beginning of any sort of bridge building or toxic polarization conversation. We have to be honest about, hey, this is where this conversation might go. This is what we're inviting you into. Do you want to be a part of that or not? So in terms of reducing harm, so I don't think it's one or the other. I don't believe that in some cases, like I said, the healing we are always going to live, unfortunately, in a world where we're continuing to harm one another. So how do we offer spaces for healing and honesty and weave that into our work and also continue the work of moving forward? I think that's the complexity that we're working to hold. I'll stop there.
Yeah.
No, I agree with you. I think, it resonates with, one of our workshops when we talk about having difficult conversations. One thing we try to build in is what we call a pivot and perspective. And if there's some skills there, but if you offer the pivot and the other side's like, I just can't do this right now, it doesn't matter whether you say, just go ahead and stop and talk. Maybe you can do it a different day, because if you're giving a perspective or you're coming at a conversation where the other side has had enough and they're not ready, it's not going to take anyway. So it resonated with me when you said we need these off ramps. That's part of what we try to do in building this in, because you're having, this, like Eric said, your amygdala is going, fight or flight. And there's times when you just can't, you've had enough. And even very close friends or families can only go so far and then they have to take a step back. So.
That's right. It's a good question. And again, not fair. The world is unfair, and it is more unfair to some. Uh, um, But I think as a I don't want to say leader, but as a racial justice activist and thinker, um, um, I also understand some harm can't be repaired. Um, um, and that is really important for us to hold. And when we are on the receiving end of harm, right, the ways we respond to that harm also take a form of practice. And so for me, I would just say this. When we're talking about individuals, and I'm going to talk about individual leaders, what repair looks like is first, right? Just it's truth seeking and personal acknowledgement. And I just want to flag in our era of social movements, that's not the mea culpa, right? It's not embarrassing and shaming people. That is not what transitional justice looks like or how it manifests on the personal level, right? That's revenge. And it is about creating the space for an individual uh, uh, to truth seek about what happened and then making a personal acknowledgement about that. The other is justice and accountability, right? That could include legal action, but it may be simply finding validation um, that the event happened and helping the person on the receiving end find support. It could mean holding oneself accountable, right? If you were the individual that played role in harm. Three, reparations for personal healing, right? Therapeutic support, financial assistance, um, uh, other services that address specific harm. And I think that's important because that's about material or emotional support that can address some of the losses of the harm experience and help the person receiving end of harm regain some control and dignity. It's also about personal reform and transformation, right? On that reflection, right? You want to uh, try to change behavior. But again, we are human beings. We will continue to stumble, I think, for at least another generation or two in our evolution, if not more. And so at the end of the day, you cannot heal harm if a community is not positioned around the idea of reconciliation and forgiveness. That is the cornerstone to transitional justice, meaning at the end of the day, the burden does return to me, an unfair burden, but a burden nonetheless, to understand that I cannot call for repair of harm without also committing to the space of reconciliation and forgiveness. I know we are at the top of the hour, so I'm going to turn it back over. What a phenomenal conversation, Robin and Kate. I just want to thank you for all of your thinking. Again, if I had had coaches like you 10 years ago, what phenomenal things I could have done for my community.
Well,
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Robin. Thank you, Kate. We are so appreciative. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to join us today. So a reminder to please take the 2-minute survey in the chat. We welcome your feedback. Would love to stay in touch on any topics around this. So please, thank you for taking the time to fill that out. And thank you again to Eric and Kate and Robin. Take care, everybody.